At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 300 programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
If you're a lineman in charge of keeping the lights on, Grainger understands that you go to great lengths and sometimes heights to ensure the power is always flowing, which is why you can count on Grainger for professional-grade products and next-day delivery, so you have everything you need to get the job done. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Nominated as one of the best British true crime podcasts, Murder Mile is hailed as a masterpiece of compelling storytelling. Research using the original police files, over 300 episodes, Murder Mile has covered hundreds of crimes you won't hear anywhere else, as well as solving cold cases, unearthing new evidence, and even discovering a serial killer no one even knew existed. For a truly original podcast, subscribe to Murder Mile.
Hello and welcome to the Cult Vault Podcast, your dedicated podcast for uncovering the darkest corners of cults and coercive control. I'm your host, Kacey, and I want to start by thanking each and every one of you for tuning in. Your support fuels our deep dives into these critical issues. Before we get started, a word of caution. Today's episode may contain discussions on abuse, including graphic descriptions of abuse, and covers a variety of human rights violations that may be triggering for some listeners. Please consider this as a trigger warning and proceed with caution. I'm thrilled to announce that I'll be appearing at CrimeCon UK in London on the 7th and 8th of June 2025, and again in Manchester on the 27th of September 2025. Join me and a host of world-leading experts, advocates and noisemakers at the heart of the true crime community. This is the UK's biggest true crime event, and you won't want to miss it. Use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, for 10% off your tickets. And remember, there are flexible tickets and payment plans available to accommodate everyone. This incredible event is sponsored by True Crime, and it's always my favourite weekend of the year. I hope to see some of you there. And for those who want even more from the Cult Vault podcast, you can access early, ad-free content by supporting me at patreon.com/thecultvault, where every pledge not only gives you exclusive access, but also directly supports the continuation of this work. Thank you again for your support and your listenership. Now, let's unlock the vault. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault podcast. Today we are back to our normal format after a couple of strange weeks of being at CrimeCon, and then doing a deep dive into the celebrity world at the moment of problematic male figures in the entertainment industry. And so today I'm joined by a new guest who is going to talk to us about something that I harp on about all the time, but not very eloquently. So I'll leave that to Dr. Bethany Usher to talk about in a more academic way. Hello, welcome to the show, Bethany.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I usually start these conversations by asking the guests to introduce themselves to the listeners.
Okay, so I'm Bethany Usher. I'm a Doctor of Journalism. I work at Newcastle University up in the northeast of England. And I used to be a crime reporter, but then I became an academic and I study the history and the ethics of crime journalism and true crime at the moment. I study other aspects of journalism and ethics of media too. But at the moment, I'm leading a project at Newcastle University, which is about rethinking the ethics of true crime content across its many different forms, including things like this, the podcast. So I'm really excited to talk to you today.
I was just saying before we hit the record button that I watched a 1-hour lecture of you talking at Aberystwyth University, and it was fascinating. You were talking all about the history of journalism, but also the way that journalism morphed into this sort of sensational storytelling, salacious type of headline grabbing true crime frenzy, basically. And I don't know if there's a way. It was a speedy 1 hour lecture, and I am so surprised that you managed to get in as much as you did. But I don't know if there's a way that you can sum up for the listeners so how that process came about and how it's impacted us today.
So I think the most important thing to understand is that crime is actually media's longest sustained genre. In print, it's been around about half a millennium. It began in Tudor England, and there was 3 parts of it that became kind of the founding discourses and have shaped crime news and crime media and true crime content ever since. So the first was around rogues and scoundrels, so kind of dandy highwaymen to kind of street gangs of petty criminals. And from this, you got the first kind of journalistic news gatherers who would expose them. They were called coney catchers, and they were doing sting operations. So where they would kind of set up these criminals, street criminals, and kind of expose them to the public and give the public tips to stop becoming victims of them. And then you got the highwaymen, which were very linked to the Civil War. And they were political figures, really, but they became very celebrity figures. And the kind of idea of notoriety really is an older element of fame than celebrity culture. And you had witch pamphlets, particularly about witchcraft trials or witches around the country and witch hunting. And you had pamphlets about murder. So bloody murder, as it was called then, or Murther, Murther was the spelling at the time. It became, a really fascinating genre. And we've got about 186, I think it is, I might be a bit wrong, surviving murder pamphlets from kind of the early modern period, and you will see things that would be very familiar in terms of language to audiences of true crime today. So they will say things like a true or exact relation. So there you get the true element of true crime 500 years ago, that link to the word true. You'll see things like horrific, barbarous, bloody, these sensational terminology. So when people kind of hit out at true crime fans or true crime creators about them being sensational, I always say, well, that's hitting out at something's nature. You can't help the fact that crime media is by nature, by creation, sensational. My argument is just because it's sensational does not mean that it also can't be a force for public good. And that we can turn this genre, we can use it as a means to fight better fights. And there is lots of true crime creators and journalists across this history who've done just that, from bringing in the first age of consent laws from girls to leniency for women who've miscarried and where there might have been increase of murder at one point, to a whole host of different things that the end of capital punishment. These were all things that were done by creators or journalists or whatever they were called during their time of this genre.
So much to unpack in what you've just talked about. In terms of kind of comparing that time in history to where we are today.
Yes.
So you said that true crime is media's longest standing genre, and I think that's kind of true of podcasts as well. Podcasts, by far the most listened to genre of podcasts is true crime. And you can, it's like this podcast is a drop in a bucket, of all the different types of true crime podcasts there are out there. And today's equivalent of watching true crime documentaries on TV, I suppose, would have been actually attending trials and hangings and all sorts of bloody things back in the day, where people would buy tickets and get popcorn or whatever the equivalent of popcorn was back then.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's 2 kinds of things to unpick on that. So the first is that podcasts and documentaries often retell older crime stories in new ways, and that can be for a good reason. So you can have what I call in my work ethical remediatizations, where the story is being told in a way that is also a new line that is in the public interest. So, for example, when you're watching things on Netflix and they might uncover misdemeanors in the investigation or by the media, or mistakes that were made, and they will tell, or they may forefront victims in a way that 50 years ago, when the case happened, the victims were not considered as matter. They're ethical remediatizations. And so when you're listening to podcasts or watching documentaries, you can spot those, and I talk about it. You can see more on my website, bethanyusher.com, where it tells you what to look for if you're looking for something ethical. There's also commercial retellings where people are just telling the story in ever more sensational detail, often just to make money. That hasn't got a new public interest line. It doesn't have a real purpose. And what people have to understand, think about this genre, is those two things have been around from the very beginning. So 500 years ago, you would have murders told, the same story covered over and over and over again, sometimes for ethical purposes, sometimes with added sensational details, maybe made up even, just to sell more pamphlets. So we're talking about pre-newspapers in the pamphlet period. So I think that you've got this. That was one part of the genre you're talking about, which is similar to podcasts and documentaries. The other element was the participatory culture of it. So particularly in London, in capital cities, where you had the scenes where events happened. So the Old Bailey, you could go to and watch. People would want to watch trials themselves, and the words of the criminals would be reported by what were then called grubs, writers that were writing around London's Grub Street, which was the first kind of area of popular culture of this kind of print culture, would go and they would report on what was said. The second was Newgate Jail, because you could pay to go in and talk to criminals in their cells. It was kind of like an entertainment, but also grubs would go in to pay them to interview them, to create their pamphlets and write about it. And then, of course, Tyburn Hill, which was the site of hanging in London. And you had these events, really, these almost carnivalesque spectacles of people being taken from the Old Bailey to Newgate Jail, and then from Newgate Jail along the streets to the gallows at Tyburn. And people would turn out and cheer them. They would give them alcohol. It was like a festivity on the thing. And then they would give their final speech. And often at the same time as their final speech was being given, people were selling copies about their final speech because they'd already got them out of them, knew what was saying at Newgate Jail. So you would have people selling them, and then you would have the crowd. And so the rich would pay to watch it in kind of grandstands set up with refreshments, and the poor would be, a kind of street level watching it. And I mean, this is depicted most famously in Hogarth's painting of the young apprentice at the gallows, which is worth going and having a look at, which really kind of maps out elements of the scene that we've just said. So, yeah, I mean, a fascinating spectacle, but people have always had this participatory desire almost. And I think what you see that most now is in things like the armchair detectives on TikTok. And we could talk endlessly about some of the recent incidents where that's got out of hand because people have this desire to participate. The family of Nicola Bulley have talked about it, for example, where people want to participate in this event in some way, make themselves part of it. So they start posting on TikTok, they start investigating it in their own way. Was it ethical? I would say not.
That is really interesting to consider when you think about trial by media, because when you were talking about these pamphlets and the way that some of these criminals would be talked about, even if they were like just a person of interest or, they were a suspect in a crime, some of the ways that these pamphlets were talking about, these people that were actually not charged yet or not found guilty yet. It was almost trial by media as we know it today with social media and digital platforms, but way back when with just a paper and a pencil.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there was elements of that. And, but it's really interesting because you've got, when journalism starts to be professionalized with the growth of newspapers in the 18th century and then throughout the 19th century, you start getting more rules about what you can and can't say, you know, gradually over the space of 150 years. But journalists today have to stick by contempt of court rules, for example. So you can't say somebody's guilty. And at the moment, there is lots of people who are doing that on social media. And I think that, you know, we're going to have there were some test cases. I don't want to go into too much detail because there were victims of sexual crimes, but people naming victims, which is, of course, illegal in this country. But there have been some incidences of prosecution of people for what they've posted on social media. But I think we need a whole spate more of them, actually, so people understand that you can't accuse somebody of being completely guilty of a crime once they've been arrested, because in this country proceedings are active, and that's contempt of court. It risks justice for victims at the core. That's what it's about. It's about protecting just victims and justice. But yes, I mean, you know, in the early modern period, you know, the 18th century and the boom of print media and modernity, as we would, the beginnings of what we would understand it today, absolutely, you know, it was anything could go. And there were some fascinating cases of trial by media and also campaigns for people's convictions to be quashed too from that period that I talk about in my book, Journalism and Crime, which really brought us to the kind of media we had today. You know, things were it was created over such a long period of time.
So your book, I believe it was published in 2023, Journalism and Crime.
Yeah, end of 23, beginning of 2024, depending on where you get it from, it says it differently, but it was finished in late 2023.
And there's another book called Journalism and Celebrity.
There is. That's my first book. And Journalism and Celebrity Journalism and Crime begins in Tudor England with the first crime pamphlets that I discussed. And, you know, it was a lot of time spent in the archives of the British Library, hunting out the earliest references to things like when was True created as linked to this. And so you can kind of see the birthplaces of some of the things we find familiar. And then Journalism and Celebrity begins with the emergence of celebrity culture in the 18th century. So we have to understand celebrity culture and journalism itself, actually, as we would recognise it today, is really an 18th century invention, although elements existed earlier than that, with the print boom of the 18th century and the emergence of consumer capitalism and democracy. So celebrity culture and journalism are like the media representations of consumer capitalism and democracy. And what I talk about in that book is how there's four intertwined. You can't have democracy and capitalism depend on one another and depend on celebrity culture and journalism. So yeah, I never intended to be a historian when I left newspapers and decided that I wanted to kind of do a PhD and think about why news was the way it is. I just kind of started scrolling back and, you know, find myself ever earlier in the archives of the British Library, which I absolutely love. It's a brilliant place to be and to spend a day working.
It's really fascinating to listen to you talk about all of this stuff, but just to see how interesting you find it as well, because sometimes when I start going on and on about cults and coercive control, people are like, wow, that sounds interesting. I'm like, I think so.
Yeah,
no. Everybody, but it is for me. So when you started looking into the kind of history of journalism, I suppose nobody had asked that question, where did it all come from? So you've answered that question now by going back through all of the earlier stuff available to look through.
Well, there's loads of journalism history books, but they tend to focus on the politics. So the place of journalism in democracy, and this idea of like journalists' unique place in the sun as the watchdogs of democracy, and that we wouldn't have democracy. And often there are more nuanced studies, but the original histories of the press were these real glory tales of like the political fight. And then there was a growing, social histories that looked at it more, journalism more as a system of social control and the place of it in propping up the state and propping up governance. But there wasn't the same focus on journalism's relationship with popular culture. I would say celebrity and crime. And what I argue is actually the fight for democracy, certain the fight for rights, legal rights, the relationship between law and order. You have to understand the relationship between celebrity culture and crime cultures too. So yes, there's lots of much older and more, histories of the press. They go back to the 1920s, actually, some of the seminal work. And there's a brilliant historian called James Curran who works at Goldsmiths University, who's written, a number of fantastic books on this subject. But my slant is different in that I focus more on the bottom-up popular culture, who are often working class, the stories of ordinary people, and how that way of journalism grew.
So you're like a historian, journalist, author, lecturer at Newcastle University. You're a woman that's wearing many different hats. So do they all come together at times, or do you find yourself often having to work like Dr. Bethany Usher as the author or as the lecturer?
I think more than ever it's come together now. I think that when you leave newspapers as a young journalist, I'd always wanted to be a journalist, and I'm quite honest about the fact that when I got to national newspapers, I was uncomfortable with things that I was asked to do. It didn't square with my ethics, and it was a really difficult situation to be in kind of my sort of late 20s, mid to late 20s, having fought so hard to get there, from a grew up in a council estate in Sunderland, worked for my local newspaper, managed to get a nationals, thought that I'd kind of made it, to go, actually, I'm unhappy here and I want to do something different. But I love journalism. I love the history of journalism. I love that at its best, it has changed the world, and it's fought for the rights of people like my family, ordinary working class people, and that I love. But for a while, I think I was kind of like nervous about talking about my work in newspaper, nervous about different things. And as I've got a little bit older, finished the book, spent more time reflecting, the change of becoming a mother, I think, kind of like helps. It's an interesting one. I had one for another day, but that kind of changes your perspective on things as well. That I'm finding that I'm much happier just to be who I am and to talk about all of my interests as a whole. And I think that launching the ethics project to try and we've come up with a new code of conduct for creators, and we were both at CrimeCon a couple of weeks ago, and I was there talking to creators about it, and loads of them are interested in signing up to the code of conduct. We've got journalists who've signed up already. We're about to kind of in the next sort of 3 to 4 months do the full public launch and see who we've got involved as the kind of first trench through it. That really makes me feel like I'm using my experience as an industry and my work towards a good. And that was why I wanted to be a journalist in the first place too. So at the moment, I'm feeling that all of these things have come together. But ask me that question again in 18 months' time, I might give you a different answer.
I love hearing all of this. I wonder if being kind of mid to late 20s and being a woman working in what I assume, and correct me if this is wrong, was still largely a male-dominated industry. Very patriarchal in its history, which you would know more than most people through the work that you've done. Do you feel like if you would have landed that job in your early 20s or late teens, that you would have found kind of the the bravery or the strength to actually voice your concerns, or that you didn't feel comfortable with any of this stuff? Because I remember being in uncomfortable work positions at that age and thinking, I want to say something here, but I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to be treated differently at work. And I'd seen that happen to other people. And with journalism, it's always portrayed as so cutthroat in other journalistic pieces or media pieces that we might consume. So I just wonder, as a woman working in that field who wasn't comfortable with those things, did you have to go through those processes before saying, actually, I'm going to do it differently?
So I was a very young reporter. So I started working at my local newspaper, my first on works experience, and then on shifts in my late teens, early 20s. And then I was crime reporter for my local newspaper by the time I think I was 23. And I have to say that my experiences in the regions were amazing. I had the best training ground. I worked with some fantastic journalists. My mentor, who I dedicated my book to, Pat Lavelle, who sadly passed away, was an incredible crime journalist, and it was really a crime reporter that I wanted to be. And I talk about in the book that the reason I wanted to be a crime reporter specifically was in my teenage years, I was a victim of strange violence, of a violent crime, which resulted in a long-term medical care. I was in hospital for a long time and still have injuries and ongoing injuries, and the prosecution of my attackers, although it took 2 years to fight for justice, during which time the charges were lowered because they were juveniles too. And I think that at the end of that, I was 13 when that happened. And so 15, 16, by the time that we were finished with the court case, I had this burning desire to give voice to victims. That was what I was going to do with my life. And so I wanted to go and work as a crime reporter. And there's a whole body of scholarship that talks about true crime fans and how many of them have been victims or survivors or known somebody who's been a victim of violence in some way. And there's this idea, there's this scholarship that says it's like that is interviewed fans, and they talk about, therefore, by the grace of God go I, that they watch the most extreme versions of what could have happened to them to help them make sense and to put their own experiences into perspective. And I would say that I didn't understand that as a teenager, certainly not. But with hindsight, I can definitely see that that was part of my experience. So I was involved with a couple of very high-profile cases at the Sunderland Echo. Wearside Jack, which was the hoaxer for the Yorkshire Ripper tapes, that he was found finally on my patch while I was crime reporter. And my news editor, who I mentioned, Pat Lavelle, had written a lot of books and had kept writing to West Yorkshire Police to DNA test the letters. So we had a bit of a head start on that work. And then a case of a man called Yoris Ho, who won the lottery while he was on remand for rape. He was a serial rapist. He'd spent 16 years, was also found in Sunderland within a short period of time. And because of that, I got the attention of the Nationals and I went off to London. And I would say that I found it overwhelming. I became ill. Yes, it was, crime reporting was a very male-dominated field, but it was at the height, I think, of a lot of unethical practices. And also the ask was for me to turn my skills as a crime reporter onto celebrities. And I would say freely that I did things during that time that I wish I had not done. But I also made the decision, which was very difficult at the time, to go, I can't do this isn't for me, and walk away. It's a real, it still can be quite a difficult period of my life, that kind of from 13, those 15 years of my life, and the level of kind of upheaval of being the victim of crime, having PTSD, putting myself in this situation where crime was part of my day-to-day life, the re-traumatization of that, and then in a really toxic environment of work. I ended up hospitalized. I'm not ashamed to talk about that. I was really, really ill by the end of those experiences, but the books became my way of making sense of that. And I'm thrilled to have found a place at where I work at the moment, where, those kind of things, those kind of experiences as seen as the strength of what I do rather than as a weakness or as a vulnerability. You know, in that way, Newcastle's a great place to work.
Out of all of this is the ethics project being born. So for anybody that hasn't heard of this so far, people that maybe couldn't make CrimeCon, even, it was a great weekend. I will be back again in September in Manchester. Would you be able to talk us through what the ethics project is? And is this on BethanyUsher.com as well?
Yeah, it's on and it's actually on the Newcastle University. Have recently done a really good piece on it, and on the blog, which is called our From blog. So it's from Newcastle to the world. But I kind of try and explain it to people, but they did a great piece on it a few weeks ago. So the idea is that we have been working with journalists, academics, victims of crime, creators to come up with a code of conduct that is fit for the 21st century of what I call in my book journalistic crime content. So true crime content, podcasting, documentaries in the broader sense, and news in the broader sense. And it's based on, some of it is from law, some of it is from existing codes of practice, and some of it is around things around representation and how we treat victims. That would be new. So, for example, one of the things that we talk about is anonymity for stalking victims and victims of domestic violence. There is no legal duty in this country to give anonymity to stalking victims. I think that is a massive oversight, and we've worked with victims who have raised this with us because actually it gives their stalker more information about them and can actually refuel it if the court case is covered. Like it gives them what they want almost, and that if you've been stalked and then you find your information splashed everywhere without your consent, then that can be re-traumatizing. So that would be an example of something that would be beyond what exists normally. We also talk about issues of representation, about including that we shouldn't include family members of criminals in stories unless they are directly linked to the crime in the court case. Then we shouldn't be, naming and shaming extended family, which is something that we do. So a range of different things that we've been working on. So I had a first draft at the end of my book as a conclusion to my book. I'm now on to draft 3 that has been done with journalists and creators and academics. The last draft will be with the podcast community and the documentary community. So I'll be doing a series of workshops over the next 3 months. I hope you'll attend one. I'll be getting other people to give their input. And then we're asking people to sign up. And what people will do is submit some sample content. And if they pass, they would get a kite mark, which indicates to audiences that their work is ethical. And then we're going to be promoting that. So I'm going to a load of audience events and true crime events to promote that to audiences so that they can spot what is ethically produced and what isn't.
That is so exciting. I found the link here in the From blog. I'll put a link to Bethany's website and to this blog post in the episode description. But that kind of segues us nicely into me saying, join us at the Northeast True Crime Forum 2025 for an immersive, one-of-a-kind experience. Participate in thought-provoking workshops, gain practical self-defense skills, and hear from a diverse range of speakers and meet local podcasters. Set in an iconic, historic venue, this forum offers a rare opportunity to delve deep into the world of true crime from multiple perspectives. The Northeast True Crime Forum.
Yes.
So that's coming up next month, and we'll both be there. That's really exciting.
It is exciting. And I've got to give a shout out to our friend Jacoa, who is the organizer, but is not very well and can't join us today. Hi, Jacoa. I hope you feel better. So yeah, this is really exciting. So Jacoa runs a club, a true crime fun club in Newcastle, where they get together, and they came to one of my workshops, the club. And after that, I went to talk to other members too on the ethics of true crime. I did a workshop, and funded by the Economic and Social Research Council's Festival of Social Sciences, which was out giving workshops to audiences around different types of ethical research. And so she asked me to become an advisor on the first event of its kind in the Northeast. So we're bringing a kind of true crime audiences event to the Northeast, and to make sure that it was ethical, that we were doing things that were workshop based, that could educate people in some way, that we don't, true crime fans and creators often get lambasted for it being sensational. And as we said earlier, there is no point lambasting something that is sensational by nature, by creation. What we need to do is to find ways of using it towards good and to use it in an ethical way. And I'm really proud to be an advisor on this event and to work with Jacoa to make sure that content that is reaching audiences and events are ethical in this way.
I'm so excited for this event, and I think the lineup is so diverse, but really interesting. There's, I'll just read some of the titles out of some of the sessions that are available, and this is on the 12th of July, 2025 in Newcastle upon Tyne, and I'll put a link to this event in the episode description as well. Crisis pregnancies and the criminalization of abortion, the ethics of true crime in social media and journalism. Sounds like that one must be Dr. Bethany Usher's. There's a self-defense class. There's Holly's Hope, so Holly's story in recognizing signs of domestic abuse. There is going to be Get Mortal Party. This workshop aims to end taboos and gently challenge both public and hidden narratives of death, dying, and grief. There's also going to be a talk on cults and coercive control. Oh, that sounds like that one must be by me. So I'll be there giving a talk about the ties between cults and coercive control beyond domestic violence, domestic abuse, and cults. So that's going to be a really interesting, interactive 90-minute workshop. It will be the first time that I've done something like that in person since my old uni days back in like 2013-14. So I'm really looking forward to that, spending time with other content creators, other people that facilitate workshops, other people that are involved in research and academics, and obviously spending another day with Dr. Bethany Usher as well.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And it'd be good to show you around Newcastle, bring you up from the northwest and show you the northeast. I hope it's weather like we have at the moment for it, because then it'll be glorious.
Yes, earlier when I emailed you, I was like, oh, the first Northwest true crime event. You're like, Kacey, it's the Northeast. And I was like, oh, sorry. I'm so used to saying, oh, I'm based in the Northwest, or, this is coming up to the Northwest. But absolutely, it's the Northeast. I'm going to be driving across to the other side. And I'm really looking forward to visiting Newcastle for the first time. It'll be for me. Wow. And just meeting Jacoa and seeing the success of this event in progress as well. I love the story of the True Crime Forum. I'm probably going to mess it up when I say this, but I remember meeting with Jacoa for the first time, and she made it sound almost like it was a weekly pub quiz type of setup where, a group of people would get together to do a pub quiz. But instead of doing a pub quiz, they would talk about cold cases or unsolved cases or things related to true crime. And that grew slowly and has become so successful now that there's a whole event being dedicated to the true crime forum. I don't know if you've heard it differently, Bethany, and I'm just messing it up.
So what Jacoa has talked about is like how during COVID, like she was really feeling this sense of loneliness and coming out of COVID, and she was looking for kind of a sense of community. And so they started doing these events, and it's once every 2 weeks, I think, that they meet up and they watch a range of documentaries and discuss their theories on it. And it's become a real community. I've been to talk to the group. I think there's now 800 members, and not every member comes every 2 weeks. I think that normally they have about between 50, 30 and 50 every 2 weeks. It's a kind of, you'll have people who come once every 6 months. You have people who come, never miss it. But that she's really built this real community in Newcastle. And what I think is really commendable about Jacoa's work was that, she could have seen this as a commercial entity very quickly. I think there was a lot of people who would have spotted this as a way of making money. But Jacoa went a completely different way, which was to seek out people who were passionate about the ethics. And that's how we met. And she wanted this to be something that was ethically done, that forefronted victims. And that when she was said, an event that isn't about being salacious, it's about actually trying to do some good from it and to educate people and to bring people together, victims with creators, in a way that, we're all coming out of it feeling like it's been a positive day.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to round the event off with a nice little round table dinner. I think like a Viking type of dinner is what I'm imagining, a banquet of sorts.
Yeah, it's in Blackfriars, which is I think it's it might be 16th century. It's certainly 17th century. It's I think an old monastery or something, which has become a restaurant. It's fantastic and has a banquet hall and function room and stuff like that. So I'm sure they will spoil us with a lovely meal at the end.
I don't know if I've ever been to a banquet hall.
It's only a little one. It's not, it's not huge, but it's beautiful.
At the event, I'll be like, and here's me in the banquet hall. That'll be my picture of the weekend. First time visiting a banquet hall. Well, I'm really looking forward to this event, and I'm appreciative of Jacoa approaching me and asking me if I'd be interested in being involved. And I am looking forward to meeting hopefully some of the listeners at the event, and then having a decompression session afterwards where we discuss some of the major revelations of the workshop and things that I was able to go and experience from other people's workshops as well. So for those people that can't make it, I will definitely give you a rundown of the day, and hopefully this will be the first of many. And I'll again put the link in the episode description for anyone interested in booking tickets. So tell me then, Dr. Bethany Usher, the only reason I say your full title is because that's how Jacoa talks about you as well. She says, Dr. Bethany Usher.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, she always says the three parts. So do you have any plans in the future to write a third book? Are you already working on that, or is that just something on the back burner maybe?
Yeah, I'm just putting together a more, so my books are obviously academic texts, so historical, but I am putting together at the moment sort of general audience history book on the history of true crime, which I hope to get out finished in the next 6 months to a year. We will see. Jacoa and I are working on a podcast project that we're hoping to bring later in the year, and I'm thinking about arrange different things. I'm one of those people who often likes to have a lot of fingers in a lot of pies. We've got a lot of fantastic educational work going on at Newcastle at the moment too, because we're launching a new sort of educational strategy for 2030 and beyond. So I've got a lot of work going on internally on that. So yes, I'm busy. But yes, I think I'll probably, my husband keeps saying to me like, oh, how long are you going to stick with the kind of crime element? What's going to be the next thing? And I think that I'll stick with this, I really am really passionate about the project. it's going to take, I'm still applying for funding to keep things like, to launch the website, to make sure that we've got the time to, to properly analyze people's content, to give them the kite mark, to develop the kite mark. I'm applying for pots of money all over the place to try and do that. But I just think it's really important work. And I think particularly what I say to creators is that if you don't do something voluntary, so the press did it voluntarily. That's why we have the IPSO Code of Conduct, which is self-regulated, whereas Ofcom is government led and is much kind of tougher in some ways, and will be really, really problematic for a lot of podcasters and creators, actually.
Yes.
So when I talk to people like you about the project, I say to them, that if we can get a self-regulation off the when people sign up to it, then that is much more likely to cover sway and to ensure that you can keep doing your good work in the future, actually. So
Yeah.
Finding the way to fund it, I think, next, so that it has some longevity, so that it's not just, me for the next 25 years deciding whether something's ethical. It does have a committee, but that's probably funded moving forward is a big bit of work at the moment.
It's hard to weigh up the pros and cons of podcasting being mostly unregulated, I think. It's like cool for independent content creators in that sense that you have that flexibility and freedom. You're not you're not constrained by the same rules and regulations that journalists may be, that newspapers might be, that TV shows might be. But at the same time, you have very, very dodgy individuals that can have a platform reaching anyone in the world, and they can say anything on that platform to anyone that listens.
Yeah.
Which is scary.
And even, one of the things I argue is that, so it's a nonsense now to keep dividing and regulation by platform, having one for print and one for broadcast. It's just not the reality of the digital world. But also, we need to start thinking cross borders too, because, for example, the laws in America around reporting are completely different to the laws in the UK. So I'm really, for example, concerned about some of the big trials we might have coming up, where in America it would be legal to name victims, but the court cases in the UK, and it's illegal in the UK to name victims. I think we're going into some really interesting territory across this genre, and worrying territory for me. So things like the Code of Conduct, and my attempt, and I'm an eternal optimist. Maybe it'll make a difference to some people. Maybe it won't, ever do it. But I do think that it's a wild west out there. The overuse of rumor and conjecture in this field is awful. It has devastating impacts on victims and their families, and something needs to be done quickly now, because things are starting to come to a head, and you're seeing more and more cases where the impacts on people are just horrific, of this wild west of speculation, rumor, and just making money out of stories. It's just awful.
Yeah, especially in this age of conspiratorial thinking. I'm just thinking specifically about Alex Jones and Sandy Hook, and how eventually that type of reporting, I don't know if that's the right word to use, but I'll use it just in this case. That type of reporting did land him in trouble, in criminal trouble. But how much damage had been done before he was picked up by law enforcement and charged? Because, there were so many family members who were impacted by the events of Sandy Hook.
I think it was I might be wrong, but I thought that was a civil case. But it wasn't a criminal case. I think it was a defamation case. You might be right on that. I can't remember off the top of my head, but no.
You would know more than I would.
The UK, there has been, there has been people who have been sued for defamation, podcasters in criminal by saying 100%, and have paid out before it's become public knowledge. I know that for a fact. I've spoken to creators and to victims who have been involved in the UK, and often it is an agreement behind closed doors. So I can't reveal, the instances or the podcaster creators involved, but that I know has happened. I think it's only a matter of time before someone's criminally prosecuted in the UK for contempt of court, because there will be a case that will be so public domain that could end up with justice being denied. And there was a really big case of this involving newspapers in the 1990s, and a footballer who was involved in an assault. I'm not going to go into it, was allegedly involved in an assault. I wanted to say, I'm not going to go into it because I don't want to make you have to legal check everything that comes into my mouth. So I'm not going to name the specifics. But essentially a trial collapsed because journalists had been involved in the payment of witnesses. There was information that was subdued, that was released, and it's kind of one of those that has disappeared into the annals of history. But I think we need to be really careful, because if a trial collapses because of content that is being put out on any platform, then those people, in my opinion, could face prosecution. And journalists have gone to jail for contempt of court over the years, many times in the history of journalism. And just because people are on social media and claiming not to be journalists and that kind of thing doesn't mean they're not having to stick by the same rules.
Right. Yeah. I think that's the big difference, isn't it? Somebody might be doing journalistic things on a podcast and say, I'm a podcaster, not a journalist, but the reporting element of it essentially is exactly the same. So
you still media law, you've still got to adhere to media law. You're not governed by a code of practice as yet, which is what we're trying to bring in, but any podcaster still has to adhere to media law. And I do get some creators that I know getting in touch from time to time, because as a crime journalist, you have to do your media law qualifications to the highest level. And my advice is always two things. Buy a copy of McNair's Essential Law for Journalists and use it as your Bible. Learn it, if you've got in doubt, look it up in McNair's. And secondly, if you're unsure, find someone you trust to seek advice from. And that is the only way to ensure it. And I do give advice to people that I know in the field and tell them when I think this is on dodgy territory.
Yeah.
Are you writing down your name, McNair's?
I did, yeah. Anytime anybody gives a book, I'll write it down.
McNair's Essential Law for Journalists is like the journalistic media law Bible, that you have to sit your exams on. So yeah, always have a copy. Any creator should have a copy of it.
So just to confirm here, it was a legal case of parents suing for defamation. So I think you're right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he may not have been picked up by law enforcement, but the impact on the families would have still been absolutely devastating, to lose your child in such a way and then hear somebody with millions of listeners say that never happened. The damage is just it's being re-traumatized all over again. And if we're not being governed by any type of stringent rules, if we're unregulated as podcasters, we can do that. We might get sued for defamation in civil cases, but we can sit here on these unregulated platforms and pretty much say and do anything. I think if there was, an extreme, like a snuff podcast, or somebody that was actually on there saying, I committed this crime and this is how I did it and this is where I hid the drugs or whatever. Maybe if somebody was actively admitting to a crime, which could then be investigated and proven, they might be arrested. I don't know. But I would much rather sign up to the ethics project and be under some type of regulation than to have it imposed on me because podcasting is out of control, if that makes sense.
I completely agree with you that the ethical people have got to start distinguishing themselves, and some people need to think about elements of their practice, for sure. What are sources, for example? What sources are being used? Verifying sources if you're looking at all cases, that kind of thing is so important. But yeah, I agree that, of course, all podcasters can be sued for defamation. Anyone can be sued for defamation. Somebody posting on social media can be sued for defamation. Same with contempt of court. Everyone is beholden to the law. It's not just journalists, but actually a regulatory code goes above and beyond things like that. So things like, is it criminal to approach somebody who's 17 and has been the victim of crime? No. Is it ethical? Absolutely not. And in the code of conduct, it will be under 18s. You can't approach under any circumstances. IPSO code of practice does the same. I think it used to be 16. I think it's 18 now in IPSO. So just things like that, persistent pursuit, banning someone's door over and over again is a form of harassment. In my journalism and celebrity work, I argued that around attack journalism and also persistent publication. So if a podcaster is focusing on the same person who may not have committed a crime or hasn't been prosecuted over and over and over and over again, that would be harassment. To say they're guilty of a crime would be defamation. So it's a wild west. The people need to really understand this better, I think.
Yeah. Myself included, I like to say that I'm an ethical content creator, but that's me now compared to me 6 years ago before I started this podcast and worked with so many survivors. So I can see the shift, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm in a place now where I can stop thinking about it and I can just say, I'm ethical now. Yeah. Like it's a goal you reach and then you can't learn anymore. It's ever changing, it's ever growing. Language, I mean, through your journalistic work alone, you must have seen how much language has changed with just around domestic violence, for example, battered women. I mean, I don't think you'll remember that term from like the early 70s, yeah. but we certainly wouldn't use that term anymore. And even now, domestic violence is not something that you hear about too much these days. So even just keeping up with language that is used in everyday conversations, in podcasting, in journalism, there's so much to consider when it comes to ethics, and you can never be done. So
and the ethics change and laws change. What is criminal changes. It has changed throughout history. It will change again. So you have to make sure that whatever is developed is adaptable, is fit for wherever the genre goes next. And of course, codes of ethics and things like the National Union of Journalists, the Crime Reporters Association over time, over the last 100 years, 150 years, develop these things in response to changes in technology, to changes in publication, to the growth of tabloid cultures. This is a living, breathing thing. The genre is a living, breathing thing, and we have to adapt our ethics and our codes of conduct and learn from mistakes. To learn. It's everyone makes mistakes, but if we learn from them and then try and do good next time round, then we have to be forgiving of that, I think.
Absolutely. And one of the best ways to do that is by just having conversations with people that think differently. I never questioned my ethics. I was like, wow, I'll fall asleep listening to Forensic Files and I'll wash the dishes listening to this story of this brutal murder and not even really be interested or fazed by it. Just really horrible consumerism of true crime content. And I was just so disconnected. And then I started to work with
movement amongst true crime fans for more ethical content.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think CrimeCon and the way that it's pitched this year I thought was brilliant at that. This kind of forefronting victims, trying to forefront ethical content, really thinking about this genre. And I think that there's some fantastic creators out there who are really, really thinking about this stuff in a meaningful way. And like that, what the work is now is to educate audiences to spot that content. There's some brilliant crime journalists in this country who spend, painstaking hours investigating, going to court, reporting stuff. How do you identify that content? Like, that is the key to the next step of the project. It's all well and good having the code of conduct, but we've got to get audiences to spot what is ethical. I mean, we talked about it earlier, is, for example, if I'm doing something where I'm talking about, because I do media history, and of course there's so many sensational stories and things like that, but if I was doing anything on a podcast platform, for example, I would not probably cover any story that was after the 1950s, 1960s. And that's my own ethics and my own experiences. And from mistakes I made in terms of reporting on crimes, historic events from the 70s and 80s, without thinking about that the victims' families could be re-traumatized by that. I talk about in my book an incident that always sticks with me, of a family member calling me and asking why I didn't give them a heads up a story was going to be revisited in the paper. And they were right. But at 23-year-old, and it was before I was born, it was a historic event in my head. And I apologized, and we talked about it in the newsroom after. But that really taught me that actually, if I'm trying to illustrate points by using it might be a sensational story that I'm using for the point of getting my message across about ethics, because it's often the best way to hook people in, that I'm not doing that with stories about people who might have living and things like that. That's a choice I made.
Yeah. I think it's those interactions with people that have the lived experience that makes a whole load of difference. So you go to CrimeCon and suddenly it's not just a voice telling you about something that happened in your ear while you hoover the house or something. It's an actual person sitting in front of you telling you about the worst day of their life, and that humanizes it so much. That takes away that sort of disembodied voice in the background that you may kind of tune into and tune out of. It's a real person that has had these real experiences. And every time I sit down with a cult survivor, that same experience happens again. This is a real person that has experienced so much trauma, had a really horrible upbringing, and to treat their experiences as voyeuristic media pieces is not ethical. And the only way I learned that was through those first-hand experiences. I would probably just still be listening to true crime content in the same way if I had never sat with somebody and had them say, look, this is real, this happened to me. These are not just experiences that you're reading about in a fiction book or in an audio book. This is still happening. There are still people that are being victimized in this way. And boy, when that hits you in that way, it's like a ton of bricks, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, there's a whole other way to look at this, to think about these things. And I know that it's something that the listeners of this podcast have heard a lot, and they'll all be singing the same tune, because it's part of an echo chamber. I don't think many people that listen to this podcast are people that are being challenged ethically. But you don't know how far the conversations with them co-workers may go, or with family members. So I always like to just have these conversations when we can. And you're an expert in this, so I'm so thankful that you've come to join me today and talk to me all about the history of journalism, the history of ethics, your future ventures. We'll see each other in 3 weeks' time at the Northeast Junior Crime Forum, which I'm really looking forward to.
On Eventbrite, I think there's a few left if anyone wants to grab one.
Yes, there's I do know Jacoa said there were a few tickets left, but I'm not sure how big the venue is, so we'll have to see how we get on. But I just wanted to ask one last question before we say goodbye. Is it exam season? Do you have like full dissertations to mark? Because you're a senior lecturer at Newcastle University. I finished a master's paper recently. It wasn't as long as it could have been, but it was still a pretty hefty research paper.
Yeah, yes, I've finished marking. We have our last board for PGT on Monday. I teach on our master's provision largely here. So we have 2 masters, media and journalism and international multimedia journalism. So one's more research focused and one's more practice focused. And we get students from all over the world, which is a joy. And finding about, as you can imagine, about how this all works legally in China and in Italy and in America and India, which is just some of the students we've had this year. It's fascinating to me.
Wow.
So yes, I will last board on Monday, but I am out of marking season. We do have dissertations over the summer that we supervise and stuff like that. And we've got, I have some PhD students too who are working in, different spaces around celebrity culture and crime cultures. So yes, it's busy, but I love teaching. I love working with people on their research and their projects. It's one of the joys of my job.
Have you ever had, I'm not going to ask you to say who or what the paper was, but have you ever had like one student come to you with a research idea and you've gone, wow, that's like groundbreaking?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I have students who've come with some, fantastic insights. A couple that spring to mind is about the growth of virtual presenting in China about 6-7 years ago, and virtual presenters. So early AI and how that was coming out. And that really opened my mind to what AI was going to do. And one of my little sidelines at the university that I do is the AI steering group. I'm director of education for the School of Arts and Culture. And so I do an AI steering group and focus group. And that's fascinating.
Add a few more things in the mix,
I'm writing a play at the moment with my friend Bethany Jones from Cardiff University on AI afterlives of true crime victims and killers on social media, which is fascinating. But and like the reanimation of photographs and of crime scenes and things like that. There's just so many interesting things that you can look at. The students never cease to amaze me with some of their things. And just every now and again, you get a lovely bit of work that you totally didn't expect. So I had an essay last year on pre-communist era China movie magazines and the stars, that somebody had got this box out of their nan's loft that had all of these magazines that had been her mother's of like from the film industry that were not archived anywhere. And they did this brilliant essay. And it was just what a joy for me to, see these magazines and to this whole part of the world that you didn't even know existed, this history of a country that I didn't know existed.
Yeah, well, I mean, people might have got into trouble if those boxes were ever found at one point in China's history, especially. So, the fact that they survived and were able to be used like a few generations on is incredible.
It's actually the Chinese government have been. There's a lot of great archived material from history. I mean, the kind of the preservation of history in Chinese culture. We have students who work who do studies of the museum sector in that field, and there is a real drive, I think, to kind of preserve and to an archive culture in that way now.
Yeah. Do you ever bump into Murder Mike in the archives, the National Archives? I don't know if you know who,
but I did meet him at CrimeCon and we had a good chat. That Murder Mile podcast, I just think, is a fascinating concept, and it's such a very interesting idea. And I think the interesting idea about it is like I was thinking about after when I'd had a conversation with them of different areas of like, I think that you would have very similar abilities, and London is obvious, but there's probably little pockets of places right around the world where you could repeat this bit of work and have like it's almost like a social history of an area as well. I think that's what's really fascinating.
Yeah. Well, here in Liverpool, I bet you could do a Murder Mile podcast about a one particular mile stretch of land in Liverpool, because you're going all the way back to the slave trade and, the Titanic, building the docks. There's a huge criminal underbelly at the moment in Liverpool anyway, with sort of drugs and car thefts and bringing in automatic weapons and things. So that's just modern day, but history is rich in Liverpool. So yeah, maybe we need to get Mike up here to do a Murder Mile Liverpool edition.
Like he just needs to move kind of like 3-4 miles probably down the road or to another city, and then you're off again with a new place.
Oh, I'm glad you got the chance to chat, because I don't know many people that go to the National Archives and will spend a whole day in there doing research, but he's definitely one of them. And his podcast is, I would say, ethically aligned with my ethics. And he's just a great guy. His name is Mike, but we call him Murder Mike because his name is Murder Mile, his podcast name. So
yeah, I mean, the archives are so rich in this country. I mean, we are the birthplace of print culture in the English-speaking language, and therefore of popular culture, as we understand it. And that came from print culture in this country, and so there's just so much. It's never ending, the fascinating things that you can find. So for everything that made the book, and the book was heavy enough, I probably had another 100 stories that just I had to cut it down because my editor was saying, you can't have another chapter. I think I had 2 extra chapters. He was like, no, we can't afford to print it if you mail this book any bigger.
Oh my gosh, you'll need to do a workbook. You'll need to do the workbook of ethics, and it could be all of these cases you didn't use, and we can talk about, how different journalists talked about these different cases and what we think is the best approach.
Yeah,
I'd be really interested, actually.
I think, I get asked to do a lot of the historical stuff. I think there's a growing interest in like the history of the genre. And I think that's could be a positive trend, because it really is the history of us. Crime media is like a mirror. It's like it's a captivating mirror almost of the darkest and the potential of who we are too, the compassion. It's all of those things. And of course, it's evolved with our laws and with who we are and our sense of self-identity and how we view our place in the world over the last 500 years as people, or as a public. It's so intertwined that I just think the history of it deserves attention to kind of better understand why we are the kind of people we are.
Absolutely. And you can track the cultural shifts and movements and moments depending on which crimes you're looking at from different periods of time as well. So that in itself, we talked briefly about witch hunters and witch trials before we hit the record button, and how that kind of all linked into the pamphlets and pre kind of newspaper growth and stuff. So you wouldn't find pamphlets about upcoming witch trials today, I would hope. So it kind of reflects the times as well when you go back and look at different media pieces, which in itself is interesting.
Though I think that you're right, we don't, nothing, but I think that the representational dynamics of women in certain aspects is and women who are being the subject of some form of attack for whatever reason, has elements of witch trials, still to this day, and that they're kind of somehow evil, intrinsically evil, like this very moralistic, language is applied to women and women who are accused of crimes. I mean, look at the kind of back and forth over Karen Reid. You know, yesterday, was it yesterday we had the verdict or the day before? And some of the comments on that, there was an element of a witch hunt to that at the beginning. And it's what's been interesting is how the narrative over time. Or Meghan Markle. Look at how she was represented. You know, there was an element of a witch hunt there, which was...
Yeah, absolutely.
Whatever she did, she was wrong. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so what I find fascinating is how the language and the themes find their origins in things like witch pamphlets, but then the language still exists and some of the themes still exist kind of 400 years on, when we're no longer we're not religious in the same way. So it's kind of put into this kind of contemporary world of crime or of celebrity culture.
Yeah.
But its roots are in things like witch pamphlets.
You would really like to talk to my two friends, Sarah and Josh, at the End Witch Trials podcast, where they work with different organizations and different individuals to get certain women that were killed for witchcraft exonerated, like hundreds of years after the fact. Mm-hmm. But they were talking a lot about contemporary witch hunts and how actually it does still exist today, just in different ways, in different manifestations. You know, people are persecuted for their beliefs to this day, or for the way that they might conduct themselves in small communities, and are ostracized, and that same language again is used to persecute them as witches, even though we're in contemporary spaces, as they would have been persecuted during the Salem witch trials era. Because I didn't know till I spoke to them that it wasn't just because it was in Salem, it was just the era that it happened was that period of time.
Yeah, no, I mean, the number of witch accusations and trials that you had during the Civil War, particularly in this country, that got really linked to this whole idea that, you know, the King Charles was a papist, which was probably linked, therefore, to witchcraft, because being Catholic at that point was something akin to witchcraft, and that these women were somehow in league with the devil to defeat the Roundheads. And you had this, one of the pamphlets that I read was about Roundhead soldiers just spotting this woman and hacking her to death by a river because they said that she was cursing them. But the reporting of it was like, which was perfectly understandable given she was clearly in league with the devil. Like, there was completely excused for these like mass war crimes, or the massacre. There was a massacre of women, of Cavalier women, and not often Irish Catholic women, of the lower soldiers by Roundheads, of a complete massacre of hundreds of women near Leicester. When I was researching the book, went and looked at the field where it happened, because I didn't want to write about what had happened to those women this day without kind of being there to see what, because you have these reports of how they came down the hill, they captured them in the field, they slaughtered, hundreds of women for just being travelling with the army. And it was all the reporting of it in the Protestant press in London was like, these were all witches. It was perfectly, and there was no condemnation of this act, and we were actually quite celebrated. So like, I do think that we have something that we, the kind of level it can reach is obviously might not be the same in terms of the levels of violence, but I actually think on a kind of mass scale, something like a witch drive, but I actually think that violence against women is still informed by some of these logics of like, somehow by being they deserved it. And I think that is maintained in some content and true crime content and crime journalism. Like, it's still, there's this sense of what did she do though to deserve this massacre? And that was the entire content at the time. So the witch trials are often seen as this kind of religious thing, but they were also heavily political things too, or the slaughter of women who were deemed as witches.
Your insights are just endless. I could listen to you talk about this stuff all day. I mean, it's like a whole lifetime of information that you've absorbed, and you could just reel it off and put it out into the world. I mean, I guess that's the lecturer in you.
Yeah, I think I love it's the wrong word. I actually am not a fan of contemporary true crime. That's the interesting thing that people think. I wouldn't class myself as a fan. I'm definitely a historian, fan of journalism, a fan of history as a thing. But I think that I just think that we can really do something special with this genre, and it has been done in the past if we get enough people involved in it. So I really do thank you for inviting me and, talking about these things, and I've enjoyed it too.
It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to spending the day with you on the 12th of July in Newcastle.
And for dinner.
And for dinner, yeah. I'm ready for a banquet. I'm ready to go for my first banquet. And thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you and all of your work, and I'll see you in a few weeks' time.
Thank you so much.